He had nothing but a lunchbox, a tired smile, and a daughter who believed the world could still be kind. She had nowhere to go, no one to trust, and hunger eating away more than just her stomach. A sandwich shared beneath a flickering bus stop light didn't seem like much. But years later, when a luxury car pulls up to his rotting front porch, that girl, now a successful woman, walks out with a house deed in hand. This is the story of how one small act of kindness changed everything. The rain came slow at first, just a soft patter against the cracked sidewalk and the dented roof of the rust-colored pickup parked at the end of the street. Jonah Miller adjusted the collar of his jacket, pulling it tighter against the early October chill as he stepped out of the hardware store, brown paper bag in one hand, lunchbox in the other. He glanced up at the gray sky, then down the road toward the bus stop. That's when he saw her. Just a kid, really, no older than 17, curled on the bench like a stray, hood up, sneakers soaked through, eyes hollow in a way that didn't come from weather. Jonah's boots scuffed the wet pavement as he approached, heart tight with something he couldn't name. Maybe it was the way her arms wrapped around her backpack like it held all the pieces she had left. Maybe it was because he'd once looked that lost too. He didn't speak right away, just sat beside her and opened his lunchbox. Half a sandwich, a bruised apple, a water bottle that had seen better days. He held the sandwich out. "It's peanut butter and jelly," he said quietly. Like that might matter. She stared at it, then at him. Suspicion flickered in her eyes. He just nodded. Encouraging. She took it, ate slowly, like she didn't trust the food not to vanish. They didn't talk. When she finished, she handed back the napkin with a barely there thank you. Jonah just nodded again and stood. "Take care now," he said before walking back toward the truck. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But something about the way she watched him leave stayed with him for years. And one day, it would come back in the most unexpected way. Jonah Miller didn't think much of that rainy afternoon as he pulled his truck into the driveway of the small rental he and Ellie called home. The gutters sagged under years of neglect. The porch steps moaned under his weight, and the siding peeled like old sunburn. But it was theirs. Kind of. As long as he could keep up with the rent and pray the landlord didn't sell it out from under them. Inside, the lights flickered as he flipped the switch, and Ellie came running down the hallway, her paint-streaked hands waving a picture. "I made us a new sign." "Daddy," she beamed, "for the front door so people know this is the Miller house." Jonah smiled, heart tugging as he crouched down to her level. The sign was crooked, the letters backward in places, but bright with color and hope. "That's beautiful." "Bug," he said, ruffling her curls. "Let's hang it up in the morning. Once the rain's gone." She nodded, satisfied, and skipped off toward the living room where her crayons lay scattered like tiny landmines. The evening passed the way most of them did. Jonah reheated leftover mac and cheese. Ellie chattered about her day at the community center, and they curled up under a fleece blanket to watch a scratched DVD of Finding Nemo for what felt like the 100th time. But Jonah didn't mind. Routine kept the chaos of life at bay. After Ellie fell asleep, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, Jonah sat alone in the kitchen, flipping through overdue bills like a gambler counting bad bets. The gas bill, the rent notice, a pink slip from work warning about reduced hours. He stared at the peanut butter jar still sitting out from his lunchbox earlier, half empty, like everything else lately. He didn't regret giving that girl his sandwich. But he did wonder, just for a moment, how much more he could afford to give when there was so little left. Work the next day was slow. The construction job he'd picked up 2 months back was drying up as winter loomed. And there were whispers of layoffs. Jonah kept his head down, took on the dirtiest tasks without complaint, and hoped that being quiet and reliable would count for something. By noon, the sky had turned bone white with the kind of cold that got into your joints. He ate his lunch at the cab of his truck, just an apple and a slice of cheese on dry bread, and thought again about the girl. What had happened to her? Was she still out there? Cold and hungry. Did she even remember him? That night, after Ellie had gone to bed, he rummaged through a box in the hall closet and pulled out an old army blanket he'd kept since his own days on the street. Folded beneath it was a pair of gloves, wool cap, and the flannel jacket he'd given the girl. He hadn't expected to get it back. But 2 days after he shared that sandwich, it had been left on the hood of his truck, neatly folded, with a note pinned to the collar that simply said, "Thank you." No name, no return address. Just that, 2 words scrawled in slanted handwriting that looked like it belonged to someone who hadn't written much in a long time. Jonah read that note again that night, long after the house had gone quiet. He kept it tucked in his wallet, right behind a photo of Ellie as a toddler. And even as things grew harder, when the landlord mentioned selling, when the truck stalled out on a snowy morning, when he had to choose between groceries and gas, that moment stuck with him. Not because he expected anything from it, but because it reminded him that even when the world stripped you bare, kindness could still matter, even if it was only a sandwich, only a silent gesture between strangers on a rainy day. What Jonah didn't know then, couldn't have known, was that across the city, in a small apartment with secondhand furniture and a borrowed laptop, a young woman was building something. And every line of code, every late night, every hard choice she made was fueled by the memory of that sandwich, that silence, and that man who didn't ask her to explain. 3 years slipped by like shadows at dusk, quiet, slow, and barely noticed until the light was gone. Jonah's days blurred into each other, a rhythm of early mornings, lunch pails packed with just enough, and evenings that smelled of cheap detergent and bedtime stories read from worn library books. The construction job dried up the following spring, and after a short stint delivering parts for an auto shop, Jonah landed a custodial job at the high school. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. Most nights, he swept halls lined with lockers dented by time and teenage restlessness, humming softly to himself while the floors gleamed behind him. His knees ached more now. The cold bit deeper, but he never complained. Ellie was growing fast, always drawing, always asking questions. Her eyes filled with the kind of wonder Jonah had long since tucked away. She started saving coins in a jar she labeled Dad's dream truck, even though she knew they barely had enough to keep gas in the old one they had. The house, if it could still be called that, leaned a little more every winter. The furnace wheezed like an old man trying to catch his breath. One corner of the roof sagged enough that Jonah had to use a bucket to catch the leak whenever it rained. He patched what he could with leftover tar and hope. But it wasn't holding. The landlord, a tired man with tired eyes, stopped by one afternoon with papers in hand. "I'm sorry. Jonah," he said quietly. "I'm putting it on the market. Nothing personal, it's just time." Jonah nodded, because what else was there to say? He thanked the man, shook his hand, and closed the door softly behind him. Ellie was at school. He sat at the kitchen table and stared at nothing for a long time. That weekend, Jonah took Ellie to the park even though the sky was overcast and his chest felt heavy with worry. She ran ahead, boots kicking up damp leaves, her laughter cutting through the gray like sunlight trying to break free. Jonah watched her, hands deep in his pockets, shoulders hunched against the wind. He didn't know how to tell her they might have to leave, that the home they'd patched together with elbow grease and love was about to slip through their fingers. She came back with a bouquet of dandelions and insisted he make a wish. He closed his eyes and whispered one silently into the stems. Something small, something sacred. Just a chance. 2 weeks later, it happened. Jonah had just gotten home from work, boots still caked in mop water. When the doorbell rang, they didn't get visitors. Not out here. He wiped his hands on his jeans, peeked through the curtain, and froze. A sleek black SUV, engine still idling, sat in the gravel drive. It looked like it belonged in another world entirely. And standing on the porch, dressed in a navy trench coat and holding something close to her chest, was the girl. Or rather, the woman. She looked different, stronger. Sure of herself, but the eyes were the same. Sharp, quiet, wounded once, but not broken. Jonah opened the door slowly, heart thudding in his chest. "Can I help you?" he asked. She smiled, small and uncertain. "You probably don't remember me," she said, "but I never forgot you." She reached into her coat and pulled out a thick envelope. "This is for you." Jonah stared, confusion furrowing his brow. She pressed it into his hands. "There's a key inside. And a deed. The house is yours now. Paid off. No strings." He opened his mouth, but no words came. She stepped back, giving him space, her eyes glinting with something close to tears. "You gave me food when I had nothing," she whispered. "You gave me dignity. You gave me hope. And now, I'm giving you home." Then, as suddenly as she had come, she turned and walked back to the SUV, leaving Jonah on the porch, holding a miracle in his weathered hands. Jonah didn't move at first. He stood frozen on the porch, the envelope in his hand growing heavier by the second. His breath caught somewhere between disbelief and awe. He could still hear the low hum of the SUV as it disappeared down the road, swallowed by the same wind that tugged at the corners of the faded Miller House sign Ellie had made 3 years ago. He looked down at it, barely hanging by a piece of twine, and then at the envelope. The paper felt thick, expensive, not the kind of thing someone like him was used to holding. He stepped inside, shut the door behind him, and sat at the kitchen table, the same spot he'd sat 100 times before sorting bills, circling past due dates, and wondering how much more he could stretch. But this wasn't another bill. It was something else entirely. Inside, the first thing he pulled out was a key, simple, silver, and smooth, the kind that looked brand new and untouched by time. Then came the deed, printed on crisp white paper with clean lettering. The property, once owned by Taylor Properties, LLC, had been transferred to Jonah Miller. No mortgage, no liens, just his name. Staring back at him in black ink, Jonah's fingers trembled as he flipped through the rest of the documents. There was even a note in the same slanted handwriting from that napkin long ago. "This house saved me before I had anything to give. It's only right it comes back to the man who made me believe in people again." He didn't realize he was crying until a tear hit the paper, blurring the ink. He wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his work shirt, laughing softly through the ache in his chest. He called Ellie into the room. She came bounding in, backpack bouncing, still carrying the science fair project she'd been working on all week. "What's up, Daddy?" she asked, setting the poster board down. Jonah couldn't find the words right away, so he just handed her the key. "This," he said, voice thick, "this is ours now. No more rent. No more packing. We're staying." Ellie blinked, then looked at him, her face scrunching the way it did when she tried to understand something big. "You mean like forever?" Jonah nodded. She threw her arms around him, squealing into his chest. "Best day ever," she shouted. And Jonah, who'd faced storms, loss, and years of uphill battles, held her close and believed it too. The next few days passed in a haze of wonder. Jonah didn't tell many people, not because he wanted to keep it secret, but because some things felt too sacred to explain. He did call the landlord to let him know they wouldn't be moving out after all. The man paused on the other end, then cleared his throat. "She did that?" he asked softly. "She told me someone might come back here one day, said it mattered more than I knew." Jonah didn't ask how they knew each other. He just said thank you and hung up. The repair started right away. It was almost like the house sensed it was finally safe to be seen again. Jonah patched the roof with new shingles, cleaned out the gutters, and fixed the steps that had been groaning for years. Neighbors offered help, nails, old lumber, and in one case, an extra pair of hands from the teenage boy next door. Ellie painted new window boxes and filled them with pansies, her favorite. One morning, Jonah found her outside brushing a fresh coat of paint onto the old mailbox. She'd written the Miller family in neat, hopeful letters. One evening, as they sat on the porch sipping lemonade out of mismatched mugs, Jonah asked her, "Do you remember the girl I gave my sandwich to?" Ellie nodded. "You told me about her once." He smiled. "She came back." Ellie tilted her head, thinking, like a fairy tale. Jonah chuckled. "Maybe, but real. She turned her life into something incredible, and she never forgot where it started." Ellie thought about that, then asked, "Did you know you were changing her life back then?" Jonah looked out across the yard, at the wildflowers Ellie had planted near the fence, the chipped bird bath now cleaned and full. "No," he said quietly. "I just didn't want her to feel alone." And maybe that was the whole truth of it. You don't always know when you're doing something that matters. Sometimes, you're just a tired man offering a sandwich to a hungry girl. Sometimes, you're just sharing what little you have and hoping it's enough. But sometimes, that moment grows. It echoes. It builds a bridge across years and cities and pain. And sometimes when the world decides it's ready, it comes back home. The following week brought more than just new shingles and painted flower boxes. It brought questions. Ellie, sharp as ever, couldn't let go of the mystery. Every night over dinner, between bites of grilled cheese or spoonfuls of canned chili, she circled back to the woman. "What's her name? Where'd she go? How did she find us?" Jonah tried to answer gently, honestly, but the truth was, he didn't know much more than Ellie did. All he had was a name scribbled at the bottom of the deed paperwork, Amara. No last name, no return address. Just a signature written with the same deliberate care as that thank you note years ago. "I think she wanted it to be enough," Jonah said one night, setting down his spoon. "The deed, the key, the kindness, maybe she didn't need anything else." Ellie frowned, not satisfied. "But don't you want to say thank you back?" Jonah didn't answer right away. He did, more than anything. But how do you repay a miracle? Jonah tried once. He took a day off work and drove 2 towns over to the address listed for Taylor Properties. It was an office suite in a modern building with glass walls and polished chrome handles. Too clean, too corporate. The kind of place where he felt like a relic just stepping through the doors. A receptionist in a headset greeted him, all smiles and no warmth. When he asked about Amara, her expression shifted into something polite and practiced. "I'm afraid I can't give out personal information," she said. "But if you'd like to leave a message, I can make sure it gets to the right department." Jonah nodded, scribbled a thank you on a scrap of paper torn from Ellie's notebook, and left it behind. It felt small, incomplete. But maybe, he thought, miracles didn't always need closure. Maybe some doors were meant to stay open in case someone else needed to walk through them someday. Back home, life settled into a new kind of rhythm. The pressure that had sat heavy on Jonah's chest for years, rent, repairs, uncertainty had lifted like fog after a long rain. He started sleeping through the night again. Ellie began inviting her friends over without worrying about the leaking ceiling or broken floorboards. Jonah bought a second-hand grill and hosted a barbecue, something he hadn't done since Ellie was a toddler. The neighbors came, some curious, some kind, and as the sun dipped low over their freshly mowed yard, Jonah found himself telling the story, not the whole thing, not the parts that still felt too fragile to speak aloud, but enough. "She was just a kid," he said, passing a plate of burgers, lost and cold. "I gave her half a sandwich, and she gave us everything." Later that night, after the grill had cooled and the fireflies blinked across the fence line, Ellie came to sit beside Jonah on the porch swing. She leaned her head on his shoulder, quiet for a long time. "You know what I think?" she finally said. "I think maybe you saved her, but she saved us back." Jonah smiled, his fingers gently combing through her hair. "I think you're right, Bug." And in that moment, he realized something else, something deeper. It wasn't just the house or the deed or the key. It was the belief that someone out there had remembered a kindness so long after it was given, that something as simple as a sandwich could ripple forward, could build a life, could carve out space in the world where hope could return. A few weeks later, a small package arrived in the mail. No return address, just their name handwritten on the front in the same careful script Jonah remembered. Inside was a leather-bound book, the kind that looked handmade, its pages thick and textured. On the first page, a note. "For the Miller family, where kindness lives, this is the story I didn't know how to tell until now." It was Amara's story, her life before and after that rainy afternoon. The nights in shelters, the jobs she'd taken to survive, the strangers who turned their backs, and the one who didn't. Jonah read it slowly, page by page, sometimes stopping to breathe, sometimes to weep. He read it to Ellie too, one chapter each night, her eyes wide with wonder and quiet reverence. By the time they reached the final page, Ellie was curled beneath the quilt her grandmother had stitched years ago, half asleep but smiling. "We're part of her story," she murmured. Jonah nodded, voice soft. "And she's part of ours." Outside, the wind stirred gently through the trees. The porch light flickered once, then held steady. And in that little house that had once been crumbling under the weight of time, two people sat wrapped in something more enduring than wood or shingles or paint. They sat in the echo of grace, a kindness returned, a story remembered, a home reborn. Amara's story didn't read like a fairy tale, it read like survival. Jonah had always imagined she came from something harder than what most people could carry. But seeing it in her own words gave that rainy afternoon a weight he hadn't fully understood. She'd been living in shelters off and on since she was 15, aged out of every system meant to protect her. Her mother disappeared when she was little, her father too drunk to care, and the streets became her teacher. She wrote about sleeping on benches, hiding in library corners, stealing bread when the hunger got too loud. She didn't glorify it. She just laid it out, page by page, like scars that had learned how to breathe. One chapter stopped Jonah cold. It was called The Sandwich. Amar described the day in aching detail, the rain, the cracked sidewalk, the way her hands had trembled from cold and shame. She remembered every part of Jonah's face, the quiet kindness in his voice, the way he didn't flinch or ask questions. She wrote that the sandwich wasn't what saved her. It was the dignity he gave her when she didn't believe she was worth anything. "It was the first time in months I felt seen," she wrote, "not as a burden, not as a statistic, just a girl, hungry and human." Jonah closed the book, holding it in both hands, and exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding for years. Ellie started taking the book to school, sharing pieces of it with her teacher, who asked if they could use it during a community reading week. Jonah agreed, hesitant at first, protective of the story and of Amara's privacy. But Amara had included a note for Ellie too, tucked in the back cover. "Share it when it feels right." She wrote, because maybe someone else is waiting for their sandwich moment. So Ellie did, and what happened next surprised them both. Kids in her class started writing letters about kindness, about loneliness, about little things that had made big differences. A boy wrote about the janitor who let him sit in the break room when he was scared to go home. A girl talked about the crossing guard who brought her mittens after noticing she didn't have any. And in each story, the same thread wove through. One quiet act, one moment, that changed everything. Word spread. The school asked Jonah to come speak at an assembly, something that made his hands sweat and his voice waver just thinking about it. He'd never seen himself as someone with a story worth sharing. But Ellie stood by him, held his hand, and said, Just tell it like you told me. So he did, nervously, quietly, from a folding chair in the middle of the gymnasium. He told them about a sandwich, a rainy day, a girl who didn't say much but said everything just by showing up again years later. He kept it simple, honest, real. And when he finished, the room didn't erupt in applause, it stayed silent. The kind of silence that listens. Then, slowly, kids started clapping. Then teachers. Then everyone. A few days later, the local paper picked up the story. Then a regional news site. Then a national one. Headlines popped up with phrases like "Single Dad Sandwich Sparks National Kindness Campaign." Jonah hated the attention. But what he didn't hate was seeing how far it reached. Schools started kindness journals. Churches used the story in Sunday sermons. A coffee shop chain printed excerpts from Amar's book on their napkins. And in the middle of it all, Jonah kept sweeping the high school halls, same as always, nodding at kids who now looked at him a little differently. Not like a janitor, but like someone who mattered. That winter, a letter arrived in the mail, official, stamped with the logo of a major nonprofit. Amara had started something called the Sandwich Project. It funded microgrants for young people aging out of foster care. It built resource kits for homeless shelters. And it named Jonah as its founding inspiration. You don't have to do anything. The letter read, "You already did everything." Jonah showed it to Ellie, who danced around the kitchen, yelling, "You're famous, Dad." But all Jonah felt was humbled. He hadn't done anything special, not in his mind. He just shared a sandwich, sat with someone for a while. But maybe, just maybe, that was the kind of special the world needed most. Quiet, simple, unforgettable. Spring came early that year. And with it, something Jonah hadn't felt in a long time, ease. Not the kind that comes from money or luck, but the kind that settles into your bones when you know, deep down, that you're no longer holding your breath. The house, once creaking under the weight of uncertainty, now stood proud with fresh paint, fixed gutters, and flower beds blooming along the walkway. Jonah spent Saturday mornings on the porch with a cup of coffee and the old radio tuned to a local station. While Ellie roller skated in circles on the cracked driveway she now called her runway. They had found their rhythm again. It was quiet. It was real. And it was enough. Then one afternoon, without warning or announcement, Amara came back. No SUV this time. Just her, walking up the front path in jeans and a windbreaker. Her hair pulled back, a canvas tote on her shoulder. Jonah was on the porch, sorting through a box of mismatched tools when he looked up and froze. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then she smiled, small, knowing. "I figured it was time I came back the right way," she said. Jonah stood, wiping his hands on a rag, heart thudding for reasons he didn't entirely understand. "You didn't have to," he said, but his voice cracked. "I know," she replied, "but I wanted to." And just like that, she stepped into the porch light again. Not as a stranger, not even as a benefactor, but as a piece of their story. Coming home, Ellie got back from school 30 minutes later and nearly dropped her backpack when she saw Amara sitting at the kitchen table, sipping lemonade and chatting with her dad. "Are you?" Ellie started, eyes wide. Amara grinned. "The sandwich girl?" "Yeah, that's me," Ellie squealed, running over with questions, wonder, and 1,000 things she wanted to say. Amara answered every one of them, patient and honest, like someone who knew exactly what it meant to be looked up to and didn't take it lightly. That evening, the three of them walked down to the park. They talked about small things, big dreams, and everything in between. Amara told them she'd been traveling, meeting with shelters, helping new branches of the Sandwich Project open, watching lives change because one man once sat beside a girl in the rain and shared half his lunch. "I didn't think it would matter," Jonah said quietly. Watching Ellie toss a frisbee to a neighbor's dog, I just thought she needed it more than I did. Amara looked at him, her eyes soft. That's exactly why it mattered. By sunset, the sky turned gold and soft pink, and Amara stood to go. She promised to visit again soon, maybe even stay for a while. There's always room, Jonah said, the words coming easier than he expected. Amara nodded, hugged him gently, and knelt to let Ellie wrap her arms around her neck. When she walked away, Ellie whispered, "She's like a real-life storybook." Jonah smiled, arm draped around her shoulders. "No," he said, "she's realer than most." And as the light faded behind them, Jonah felt something quiet settle inside him, a full circle, a finished sentence, and a peace that comes when love, given freely, finds its way back home. They never did put up a sign that said miracle happened here. Though Jonah joked about it once, Ellie had laughed, then drawn one anyway, crayon letters and stick figures, taped proudly to the fridge, because for all the stories that would come and go, for all the people who might read Amara's book, or hear about the nonprofit, or watch the viral video clip of Jonah speaking at that school assembly, what mattered most wasn't what had been built around them, it was what had been built between them. Their life didn't change in the way movies often promise. Jonah still worked. Ellie still complained about math. The roof still leaked a little during spring storms, but there was joy in the mundane now. Peace in the repetition. Gratitude in every quiet morning and every bedtime hug. And though Amara's visits were few, each one brought something new, not just updates on her work or stories from the road, but laughter around the dinner table, advice shared on the porch, and a bond that no one could have predicted from a moment so small it almost went unnoticed. One night, months after her last visit, Jonah stood at the bus stop where it all began. It looked different now. New bench, fresh paint, but he could still feel the echo of that day, the rain, the silence, the girl with too many shadows in her eyes. He sat for a moment, pulled a sandwich from his coat pocket, and left it on the bench with a note. "If you're hungry, this is for you. No questions, just kindness." Then he stood, pulled his collar up against the breeze, and walked home under the sky that had never looked so clear. Because sometimes the best stories don't end, they ripple. Quietly, endlessly. And they begin again, with something as simple as a sandwich. Sometimes, we think we need grand gestures to change a life. Money, power, the perfect words. But this story reminds us that the smallest acts, the quietest kindness, the unspoken moments of human decency often echo the loudest. One sandwich, one seat on a bench, one man who didn't look away. That's what started it all. Life isn't always about what you have. It's about what you give when no one's watching. Jonah didn't have much, but what he had, he gave freely. And it came back to him in ways he never imagined. That's the beauty of it. The real wealth of this world isn't measured in what we own, but in the love we're willing to show, even to strangers. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of the power of compassion, or made you think of someone who once changed your life with a simple gesture, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs hope today. Follow us for more stories like this, where ordinary people show us what extraordinary really means. And remember, your moment to be someone's miracle might come quietly, wrapped in everyday life. Be ready, be kind, and never underestimate the power of a sandwich.